How did a Portuguese gangbanger from Greenpoint, Brooklyn, end up together with a single mother of three who'd been kind of neglected and abused by her previous husband? Today I'm going to talk about the parents that made me. Now, this channel is the story of my life. So how could I possibly go on with the story of my life without talking about my parents? Both of them were born in 1930. My father in May, my mother in December. It was a true May-December romance. And their initial meeting was less than ideal. My father was in a Brooklyn street gang called the Apache Warlords, along with his brother, my uncle, who I really don't think of as my uncle, but that's a story for another day. And one day he walked into the local candy store, which was more than just a candy store. They had the fountains and all of this. This is probably in the mid-40s. And my mother was there with a couple of her girls, a couple of friends. In the mid-40s, there was a term that you would use to refer to somebody who was maybe not so smart, but thought of themselves as tough. And it was considered a insult. And that term was goofer. Well, my father walks in with his brother, I believe, and walks right past my mother's table. And my mother looks up at him and says, "What are you, some kind of goofer?" My father, being the person he was at that point, actually lunged across the table at her. And he was held back by his friends and his brother, I guess. And that was the end of it. Actually, my mother said that she and her girls kind of laughed a little bit about them afterwards. Fast forward. My mom got married. And the man she married was, again, less than ideal. And he decided to take her out to, basically at that point, the wilds of Long Island. Kind of East End Long Island on the North Shore. And isolate her from everybody. And she didn't have a car. But she ended up with 3 kids. And he basically didn't make himself present at all. He would go into New York City and be gone for days. And bottom line is, my mom figured, okay, I can't keep living like this. So she packed up her 3 kids and got in touch with her father, who is all she had because her mother had abandoned her as a child. And her father came out and got her and brought her back to Greenpoint, Brooklyn. My father, on the other hand, had kind of gone the way of what you would expect from a gangbanger in the streets of New York. But he'd separated himself from that life and gone over to truck driving. Now, understand something. My father was driving a truck at the age of 14. Why they let him get away with it, I have no idea. But they did, and he was driving a truck at the age of 14. And he was still truck driving when my mom, walking down the street in the Greenpoint, Brooklyn, on her way to a job interview, came across this guy who she'd called a goofer a number of years earlier. He crossed the street started talking to her and convinced her to take the day off. Don't worry about this job interview. Come with me to Coney Island. Well, she did. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, my father was not knowledgeable about parenting, if you want to put it that way. All he had was the example of his parents. And his parents, my grandparents, were very, very strict. His father, my grandfather, was a hard man. And he'd worked. He was one of the few people in that neighborhood who managed to work through the entire Great Depression. He was a shop foreman for a company called Paul Revere Copper and Metal Works. They used to make cookware. And he never was put out of a job. So he was a hard-working, very tough man. And that's all the example my father had. So this guy who went from being a truck-driving gangbanger became an instant father of 3. My brother and 2 sisters. And that was in, I believe it was 1958 when they got married. In 1960, here I was. So he was now a father of 4. And I was suddenly proclaimed the golden child. I was the spoiled little brat, quite honestly. And pretty much by both my father and my mother. My father was never shy about corporal punishment. He used to have his belt, what he called a garrison belt, and if you saw that thing coming off his waist, you were done. Your day was over. But when it came to me, I was overprotected. I was very coddled. And as much as my father would proclaim great things about being in a gang and being tough and being street smart, he didn't want any of that for me. And wouldn't allow me to even do anything remotely dangerous. When we moved to Lindenhurst, we had 2 big apple trees in our backyard. And I wanted to put up a rope swing. No. That was too dangerous for his little boy. But he is the man that taught me how to fish. But he wouldn't let me tie rigs. Why? Because tying your own surf casting rigs had a high likelihood that at some point you were going to get a hook in your hand. He coached me in baseball and really wasn't that protective of me then, but wouldn't let me play the infield because I was too close to, I could have gotten hit by a ball. And actually we did end up on our team having somebody get hit by a pop-up right in the middle of his forehead, get knocked unconscious on the field, and have to be taken to the hospital. But that's part of playing baseball. So, as protective as my father was, and as determined as he was to ensure that I never got into fights the way he did, that was why he told me, that if I went into junior high school and got into fights or got suspended because of fighting, he was going to, as he would put it, turn me into sawdust. That was one of my father's expressions. My mom, on the other hand, had him pretty much wrapped around her little finger. I have said to my wife innumerable times that that is the most in love I've ever seen two people until I met her. And that is the kind of marriage that I wanted to have. They literally would do anything for each other. When my father passed away in 1999, my mother went into a literal breakdown. And even with that having happened, I have often thought to myself, it's better than if she'd have gone before him, because he would not have been able to handle it. Now, as I said, my father was a truck driver. From what he told me, he dabbled, for a very, very short period of time in over-the-road truck driving, but he ended up being a local truck driver. When we moved to Long Island, it was for a company called American Candle. They ended up going out of business, and actually because they burned down. And he went to a company called Crown Light, fluorescent lighting. My mom, when we moved to Long Island, became a secretary for what I believe is the largest cemetery on Long Island, Pine Lawn Memorial Park in Farmingdale, Long Island. And she worked there until she retired. My father, Crown Light, was laying people off and not doing well. He ended up working for a company called Bruce Transformer, and that was where he was when he retired. My mother was a secretary basically her whole life. And she was quite happy with that. My father was a truck driver his whole life and was not happy with that. But that's how he could make a living, and that's how he could support his 4 kids and his wife. Both of them had to work. We were not in any condition to have either one of them not be working. And that's pretty much it. That's why I was a latchkey kid when I was in elementary school all the way up to high school. And then in 1993, my mother and father had retired, and they decided they'd had enough of Lindenhurst, they'd had enough of Long Island, they'd had enough of the Northeast and the cold, snowy winters, and moved to Ocala, Florida, which is where they were when my father passed away in 1999. And my father loved it. My father absolutely loved it. And he had become far less tough than he'd ever been. At that point, he had met and actually lived with my son, his grandson. And you want to talk about somebody turning into a softie? My son just had to walk into the room and my father melted. My mom did not like Ocala. She would have been quite happy to stay somewhere northeast, close to her kids, and just kind of tough out the cold winters. But she acquiesced and moved to Ocala with my father, and that was the last place they lived together. And then, like I said, in 1999, on April Fool's Day of all days, my father passed away from a massive heart attack, what my wife, the nurse, has termed the Widowmaker. And my mom passed away in 2005. She was living with my sister, my oldest sister at the time, and that was August 2nd, 2005, and she passed away from lung cancer. So there you go. The story of my life continuing with the story of my parents' life. I'm Felix Gomes, and this is the story of my life.